It was a cool autumn morning, and the small town I had called home for the past several decades seemed peaceful, as it always did at this time of year. At 71, I didn't get out much anymore, but I was content. The quiet rhythm of my days felt comfortable, full of books, tea, and the occasional visitor. My niece Sarah had promised to stop by that day, along with her husband Ben. It had been a while since they'd come over, so I was looking forward to their visit. Sarah was always so thoughtful, making sure I was doing well. And Ben? Well, I liked him, though I didn't know him as well as I would have liked. The doorbell rang, snapping me from my thoughts. I slowly made my way to the door, and there stood Sarah, smiling brightly, her dark hair framing her face. And beside her was Ben, a man of few words, but with a presence that made you take notice. "Aunt Margaret, it's so good to see you," Sarah said, giving me a warm hug. "This is Ben. Finally convinced him to visit you today." Ben smiled politely. "Nice to meet you, ma'am," he said, shaking my hand. His grip was firm, and I could sense his quiet strength, the kind of person you'd rely on in a crisis. "Nice to meet you too, Ben," I replied with a smile. "Come in, both of you." We settled into the living room. There was a lot of small talk about work, the weather, and how things were going back in the city where they lived. But as the conversation unfolded, I felt something shift. They genuinely seemed interested in my life, in my thoughts. It was refreshing. As the afternoon drifted toward evening, we began talking about their plans for the future. Sarah, ever the dreamer, had big ideas for a career change, and Ben had been thinking about taking more risks. It made me feel youthful again, hearing their energy, their enthusiasm for what lay ahead. "You know, Aunt Margaret," Sarah said with a mischievous grin, "it's been a while since you've gone anywhere, right? How about we take a little trip today, just the three of us, get out of the house for a bit?" I hesitated for a moment. It had been years since I'd really ventured far from home, but there was something in her voice, something in the way Ben nodded that made me think, why not? "A trip, huh?" I said, pretending to mull it over, though the idea was already growing on me. I suppose I could be persuaded. "Great," Sarah said, practically bouncing with excitement. Before long, we were in Sarah's car, an older model but well-kept, as we headed out of town. Ben drove, his hand steady on the wheel, while I sat in the back, watching the familiar landscape roll by. The trees were beginning to change color, the vibrant reds and oranges offering a beautiful contrast to the pale blue sky. We drove through quiet country roads, the car's hum filling the otherwise silent air. There was something magical about being out on the open road again. As we drove further, Ben turned off the main road, onto a path I hadn't seen in years. It led us to a small hidden park, a place I used to visit as a young woman with friends. A small pond glimmered in the fading light, its surface reflecting the brilliant colors of the sunset. I couldn't help but smile, the nostalgia settling over me like a warm blanket. This was a place full of memories, some joyful, some bittersweet. The car stopped at the edge of the pond and we all got out. The air was crisp now, the kind of cold that reminded you that fall was in full swing. Sarah and Ben walked a few paces ahead, talking softly, while I stood by the water's edge, lost in my thoughts. I noticed Sarah glancing at me with curiosity. "Escaped?" she asked, intrigued. I hesitated. It wasn't often I spoke of the past, the days when I was young and full of fire. "Well, as a young woman," sometimes you just need a place where no one knows your business, where you can just breathe, I said, smiling. It was a place for secrets, for late-night talks, for things that weren't meant to be spoken aloud. Ben raised an eyebrow, a small smirk appearing on his face. Sounds like you had some good times here. Good times and bad, I replied. But that's life, isn't it? For a moment, there was silence. Then Sarah broke it with a laugh. You know, I always thought of you as the wise aunt, but now I see you've got a bit of mischief in you. I chuckled, feeling a bit of the old spark inside me flare up. Perhaps, I said, but I've learned that life's too short to take everything so seriously. Ben nodded in agreement. You've got that right, he said. There's no point in looking back and wondering what might have been. You just have to enjoy the now. We stood by the pond for a while longer, just being present, sharing quiet moments. The sky had darkened, and the first stars began to appear, twinkling above us. It felt like time was stretching out, as if the universe had slowed just for a moment, allowing us to truly connect. Sarah, ever the planner, laid out a blanket on the grass. Let's stay here for a bit, she suggested. And we all settled down side by side, watching the stars reflect off the surface of the pond. The air was calm, the kind of peace that only comes after a long day's journey. It felt timeless. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't just the older generation, the one with all the answers. No, in that moment, I was simply one of them, part of the shared experience of being human. As we sat there, the conversation quieted, and the stillness of the night enveloped us. But there was something unspoken between us now, an understanding that transcended age. We were all here, together, experiencing something unexpected. And for the first time in a while, I didn't feel my age at all. I sat there in the quiet of the night, feeling the weight of their words hanging in the air like a delicate thread. The atmosphere around us had shifted, becoming something far more intimate and contemplative than when we had first arrived. It wasn't just the closeness of our bodies or the vulnerability in our voices. It was the understanding that had formed between us in these fleeting hours. Here comes Andrew, my nephew, and his friend Nath, sitting together and talking. The atmosphere around us had shifted, becoming something far more intimate and interesting. Nath's steady gaze, his calm demeanor, and Andrew's almost restless energy, it all converged in a way that made me realize how much I had been taking for granted in my years of solitude. For so long, my world had felt small, confined to the walls of my house and the quiet routine I had come to cherish. But now, in the presence of these two, it felt as if the world was stretching out before me once more, full of possibilities I had long ago forgotten. Andrew cleared his throat, breaking the silence, his hand still gently resting on mine. I think what Nath means, he said, his voice softer now, is that sometimes it's not about knowing what's next or having it all figured out. Sometimes it's just about being here in this moment and letting it be what it is. Nath nodded, his eyes meeting mine with a depth that felt almost too much for me to bear. Exactly. And right now, all that matters is that we're here, together. And for that, we should be grateful. I felt a warmth spread through me, both from their words and from the quiet peace of the lake. It was true. Life wasn't about having everything laid out, about chasing every desire or ticking every box. Sometimes It was simply about embracing the beauty of the present, the people around you, the connections you shared, the simple joys of a quiet evening by the water. For the first time in a long time, I felt something stirring deep within me, a sense of aliveness that had been dormant for years. It wasn't just nostalgia for the past, or regret for the things I hadn't done. It was a recognition of something I'd forgotten. That life, even at 71, could still surprise me. "I suppose you're right," I said quietly, looking between Andrew and Nath. "There's no point in chasing the past, is there? Life is always moving forward, and sometimes the most important thing is to be open to the present, to the moments you didn't expect." Andrew smiled, his grip on my hand tightening ever so slightly. "Exactly. I think that's why we're all here tonight, to remember that life doesn't stop, no matter how old you are, and sometimes the best things come when you least expect them." There was a silence that followed, but it wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that only comes when you truly understand each other, without needing to speak. The kind of silence that tells you that, in this moment, everything is as it should be. As the night wore on, the stars above us seemed to multiply, casting their soft glow over the lake and the three of us. I could feel the pull of the past and the future, tugging at me in different directions. But I also felt something deeper, something that transcended time. The connection between us wasn't just about who we were in this moment. It was about the shared experiences that had led us here, to this very spot, where everything seemed to align in a way I couldn't explain. At that moment, I realized that life had a way of giving you second chances, of offering unexpected gifts when you least expected them. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as far removed from the world as I thought. I still had so much to give, so much to experience, and so much to share. As the stars twinkled above, I squeezed Andrew's hand in return, and Nat, who had been silent for a moment, finally spoke again, his voice softer this time. "We're here for you, Auntie," he said, his words simple but filled with so much meaning. "And if there's ever a moment when you need reminding of how much life still has to offer, we'll be here." I looked at both of them, Andrew, the nephew I had watched grow up, and Nath, the mysterious and thoughtful friend who had become so much more than just that. There was an unspoken promise between us, a recognition that the future was still unwritten, and that no matter where it led, we would walk through it together. And in that moment, I knew that the night was far from over. It had only just begun.